and welcome to a special edition of World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Trade negotiations between China and the U.S. taking place this week are another important step to build confidence in bilateral relations. Over the decades, there are many who are instrumental in building and maintaining relations. Today, meet three of them and hear their insights both on the short and the long term. First, Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has been frequenting China over the past decade as both an observer and an advocate for strong connections between the two economies. He did sound the alarm over the dangers of letting geopolitics define relations now. Are you worried about the Chinese economy?
I think the Chinese economy is doing reasonably well. You have to put it in perspective. And remember, Chinese economy now in PPP is as large as the United States. So 6% on an economy of that size is a lot of growth.
With what it is going on right now and the also further opening up policy as the Chinese government described, how much do you think this will be able to help U.S. and China come to certain kinds of consensus?
It's American politics, the politics of blaming others for America's problems that are at the root of Trump's agenda. He blames unfair trade agreements. We wrote most of the trade agreements ourselves, so how he can blame anybody else is absurd. But
the question is, China and U.S. is at this critical juncture, and they have to make very reasonable decisions at very critical times, one after another. So what can we expect, Professor?
Well, there are both stabilizing and you might say destabilizing forces. Stabilizing is we are economically very interdependent. And so a rupture in trade would be extraordinarily costly for the United States, very costly for China, and it's in the mutual interest of the two sides to grow together. 40 years ago, China was a very poor country. Nobody thought that China could be
this
big. When China is growing at 3%, U.S. is growing a little over 2%. China is going to be much larger than the United States in 25 years. Some Americans look at this as an economic threat, a competition. The basic perspective of economists is it's not a zero-sum game. China's growth helps America, America's growth helps China. So it's not a zero-sum game.
So my question really is, what can we do to address the root causes? For example, when you're an economist, Professor, how to deal with some of the problems that U.S. economy is facing right now, particularly the wealth gap and things?
Well, so there are, as you say, much of the problem in the United States are of our own making and our failure to address them.
Just like many problems in the other countries are also their own failure to look at them.
Exactly. I mean, globalization is a global force, technical change is a global force, yet America has wound up with more inequality than any other country. And it's because of a whole variety of ways in which over the last 40 years we've rewritten the rules of the economic game to favor the 1%. It's more than incomes. It has to do with security. A lot of this is anxiety. United States went through a very deep recession in 2008. But it's also a question of the way, you might say, fairness. Our political system saved the bankers who caused the problem and let millions of Americans lose their homes and millions of Americans lose their jobs. And there's angry. Unless we internally solve those problems, there's going to continue to be tensions. Not just with China, we're having problems with Mexico, we're having problems with Europe. Most of those are Trump. Most of those, when Trump goes, will be resolved. But some of the longer-standing issues of competition with China are still going to be there after Trump goes.
Professor Stiglitz, what's likely to be the nature of this competition, even without the factor of Trump between China and the United States?
It will depend on how politics in both countries manages this. You know, I would hope.
So you are saying let's give all the powers to the politicians and let them decide on whatever the decision will be about our own future.
No, I would put it a little bit differently. What I was trying to say is I think the politicians are going to be very important in this. But if there is a strong recognition from the business community that they have a mutual interest, if there's a lot of, for instance, joint research projects, if there's work together on climate change, the more the two countries cooperate, the more they'll see their interest as interdependent, and that will help the politicians see the right way. But the problem is there's always a tendency on politicians to try to take use nationalism to advance their own interests and to get people behind them. I hope it doesn't happen, but we know it has often happened in the past.
All dependencies between China and the United States, it's just a matter of fact, as we all know.
That's right. It's such a high interdependence, and I think most Americans grasp this, and they just have to be reminded over and over again and they've begun to see it. I mean, for instance, when Trump began to put some of the tariffs on, American agriculture started to worry, and the United States was very careful not to put tariffs on consumer goods, because if we did that, a direct impact on our poor Americans who depend on apparel and shoes and so many other things. So we are very interdependent, but at the same time, one has to recognize the power of demagogue and the power of the forces that are pulling us apart, and not pretend that, as you said, that when Trump goes, everything is going to be back to normal.
Right. It seems that, Professor Stiglitz, this time you're talking about more politics to me than any other time that I interviewed you over the years. Are you sad as an economist?
Yes, I am. I'm sad that our politics didn't address the issues of inequality that gave rise to these tensions. I'm sad we didn't invest more in the United States in, for instance, renewable energy, solar panels. That we didn't invest more in AI. But that's, again, our failures.
But I guess we hope the U.S. biggest export is not anger.
That's
something
right.
else.
That's right.
That's just a joke put aside. You see that China is trying to streamline its economy. Chinese government talk about increase the well-being of the Chinese people. How do you think, from an economist perspective, that can be done and should be done?
Well, I think the emphasis that has been put on the quality of growth rather than just the quantity of growth is absolutely important. Key to that is education, health, creating livable cities, a better environment. All of these things are absolutely essential. I think they can be done very, very quickly, and they will support economic growth. So to me, it's not a trade-off. These are things that will actually strengthen the Chinese economy today.
To do it very quickly, usually it involves a lot of state sectors. But that is not necessarily how you look at the growth of the market, right? You still want the market to play a decisive role. So that is a gradual process.
I think you have to have both the state and the government and the market the market creates a lot of problems, and we have to recognize that. It creates, on its own, it will despoil the environment, it will create inequality, it won't solve the health problems, it won't solve the education problems. And so, yes, in certain areas like steel and producing pencils and chairs, the market plays a role. But the decisive role in the things that affect people's well-being, environment, health, education, creating livable cities, the state has to play a very central role. It can use market mechanisms, but you cannot do this without an important role for the state.
It's always a beautiful balance that one has to take.
You always have to get the balance, and I think China began to restore the balance by increasing the market, but one now has to be in a stage where you really need to bring again the government to solve the problems that the market created and restore the balance that I think has been lost a little bit.
Professor Stiglitz, it's always enticing talking to you. Thank you so
really
much,
enjoyable.
Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's Joseph Stiglitz, a professor at Columbia University and a Nobel Prize winner economist. Coming up, Stephen Roche, a seasoned mind and a sharp communicator, about what he sees as the real solution behind the China-U.S. trade dispute. Both have to deal with their own internal challenges as well. More about that after that. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Today, a special program featuring some of the most prominent figures who try to build bridges between China and the U.S. amid challenges to bilateral relations. Now let's meet Stephen Roche, a senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. He's vocal about his views on what's troubling U.S.-China relations. In my most recent interview with him, Roche argued the U.S. must deal with its trade deficit not by picking fights with others, but by cultivating more equal opportunities from within. Professor Roche, what a pleasure to see you once again in Beijing.
Great to see you too.
Great to see you. You got some very convincing statistics for us, illustrating the U.S. trade deficit, how it was formed, what's the reality. One thing you talk about is how many countries the U.S. has trade deficit with. Tell us more about that.
Well, we have a multilateral trade problem, which means we have deficits with many, many countries. And it comes from our shortfall of savings. When countries don't save, and America doesn't save, and you want to grow, you import surplus savings from abroad, and you run a big current account deficit to attract the capital. And that gives rise to this multilateral trade imbalance. We had trade deficits last year, for example, with 102 countries, ranging from China,
which is the biggest one,
which is by far the biggest, Germany, Japan, Mexico, all the way down to small places, believe it or not, the Vatican. We run trade deficits with over half the countries in the world.
I wonder what Vatican exported to the United States.
Well, I joke when I talk about the Vatican. I'd say it's part of our spiritual deficit. But it's not a particularly big item, but it's just indicative of the fact that our trade deficits are pervasive. And it's a multilateral problem, and the problem with U.S. trade policy right now is we're trying to find a bilateral fix for a multilateral problem, and it won't work. Because if we don't adjust the saving rate upward, if we go after one trading partner, like China, with a bilateral fix, the Chinese piece will be spread to other countries who are higher cost producers, and that will be the equivalent of a tax hike on American consumers. So it's a losing proposition.
But how to solve that problem? That is a big problem for a long time.
The main factor holding back our saving, believe it or not, is our big budget deficits. So in 2017, at the end of the year, the Congress and the Trump administration pushed through a gigantic tax cut, which is lowering our savings rate even more, which will create bigger problems for our trade deficits, not just with China, but with the other 101
countries as well. But they're arguing
that's
exactly why the economy is doing so well right now in the United States.
Well, it did well for a while, but as we say, the bloom is off the rose. I mean, the growth rate has decelerated for 4 consecutive quarters in a row. It was 4% in the second quarter of 2018, fell to 3 in the third quarter, 2 in the fourth, and 1 in the quarter that's now ending. So, you know, it was what we call a sugar high. It felt good. It was very sweet while we ingested it, but the taste is worn off, and the economy's gone back to its pre-tax cut sluggishness.
Right. So you think there has to be an overall rethinking of the U.S. economic policies to begin with. But you know, Professor, that's not going to happen, right?
I think, you know, as we move through this period of challenging political leadership, challenging economic leadership, we have an adaptable, flexible, resilient system. And I think, you know, I'm hopeful that, you know, if we do get a shift in leadership, that there'll be a rethinking of economic policy that will go along with that.
That's the other thing, that there are people pin all the problems to Trump himself, as if a change of person in the White House will solve all the problems. And you know that's not true, because the trade deficit thing, the budget problem has been there for a long time.
That's
the
very
saving
true. That's
issue
very
is
true.
a tradition of American consumers.
Well, but let's hold on a second. Let's check that with data.
Go ahead.
In the final 3 decades of the 20th century, our domestic savings rate, adjusted for depreciation, which you should do to measure it correctly, averaged 6.5%. Today, the number is about 3. So we're operating at less than half the longer-term historic average. So there's been a big shift down recently, reflecting reckless fiscal policy. If we can address that and at least get back to the norm in the final 3 decades of the 20th century, that will make a difference. It won't solve the problem, you're entirely right. But it'll make a difference in an otherwise very difficult problem.
What are the other things that would make a difference in terms of reducing the U.S. trade deficit?
Certainly, if we are able to save more and plow back more of that saving into a rebuilding of infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, even human capital, then campaign slogans like Make America Great Again will also be grounded in more of a saving and investment support than we have today. It's hard to be competitive if you don't have the wherewithal to invest. And our lack of saving reflects, unfortunately, precisely that.
Last year, U.S. has already identified in 2 white papers that China as a strategic rival. Well, linking that with the many problems that you're talking about that the U.S. could change for the better, could that also be a momentum the U.S. administration could use very well to change its pattern of doing things for the decades and also be able to make the economy more efficient?
You ask a complicated question. I mean, our view of China as a strategic rival. Or strategic threat, whatever you want to call it, that is a strong geopolitical statement, and it has repercussions on China as well, because it certainly makes the Chinese feel as if America is very focused on containing its rise, and that's a serious concern in China. In the same sense, the United States feels that China aspires to capture new emerging industries, and America views that as an existential threat to its very future.
Right. The question really is, if there is a threat, whether that's true or not, if people perceived there is a threat, threat. Will that bring the strength together and get things done? That's my issue. Let's just put the Chinese issue aside.
I would prefer to say that we would rise to the occasion if there is a strategic challenge as opposed to a strategic threat. We're splitting words. You might say it means the same thing. I view it differently. I think that when there's a challenge, America has a long history of welcoming challenge and rising to the change.
Exactly.
All we want is an opportunity to compete fairly. And there's a big debate in America that, with respect to China, there's not reciprocal treatment, so we're not being given the fair shake that we've grown accustomed to. And that's debatable, I would say, to be quite frank, but I grant that that's a concern.
On the U.S.-China front, finally we're reaching here. The negotiations are still going on, but the question is much more than the negotiation itself. It's only probably a step in the long road. So, Professor, as an economist, how do you see this uncertainty for the two economies, the largest economies in the world?
Uncertainty is the biggest enemy of business decision-making. When you're running a big company and you're thinking about the key decisions about expanding your capacity at home or hiring new workers or investing in a new product line, you hold back if you're uncertain about the future. And when there's questions that are going to be lingering long after this deal is done with China, that could have a major impact on your uncertain future, that's going to inhibit a lot of the key decisions that businesses need to make that would drive the economy. So it's a negative for economic prospects going forward.
Now, China tries to be proactive in terms of looking at the challenges between China and the United States. That's what the Chinese government believes. Whether this will be really seen as constructive from the other side, what do you think?
I think, with all due respect, the Chinese need to think out of the box a little bit, and Americans do too. I think.
What are the out-of-the-box things that you're talking about?
Okay, I mean, this new foreign investment law, it doesn't do it for me. It really doesn't. Let's start with a clean slate. What I would like to see is not, a lot of complex language about fair and reciprocal treatment, but agreement between two countries on a bilateral investment treaty. We've been trying to negotiate it for 10 years, and we got very, very close in the Obama administration, and we've given up. If you were able to complete successfully a bilateral investment treaty, you would eliminate all foreign ownership caps. You would eliminate the need to have joint ventures. That may make China uncomfortable, but that would take the issue of forced technology transfer, which is such a sticking point in this trade dispute, off the table, because there wouldn't be joint ventures and there wouldn't be any structure that would force it. And of course, this would have to be a compromise, so the U.S. would have to give on its side as well. And recently we passed an expanded oversight of our CFIUS Committee on Foreign Investment, which is very much aimed at China. And we have to back off on that too. Because if we want access to China, China deserves access to our markets as well. So let's stop solving this with complicated language that really doesn't achieve much at all, in my view.
But that's not likely to happen, is it? That's exactly the opposite direction that is happening right now.
Yeah, I've often been accused of being guilty of wishful thinking. But I just go back to the last 10 years of very serious and focused negotiation on trying to achieve agreement on a bilateral investment treaty. We got very close. It was a strong commitment of leaders from both countries. Why can't we recapture that spirit? you say it's not realistic. We were very, very close. So turn back the clock a little bit and try to come up with something that is truly workable, that takes one of the most contentious issues off the table. We can do that.
What tools, Professor Roche, do we have in mind to turn back the clock?
Well, you know, that's a great question, and you know, it's not magic. I mean, we do have certainly a leadership in the U.S. administration.
And that's only a part of the problem.
That is a manifestation of a problem that's been building for a number of years. I'd say the last 15 years, this type of thing was waiting to happen. I wrote a book 4 or 5 years ago about the codependency of America and China, and I concluded by saying that this relationship where we both depend on each other so much is really unhealthy in the end if we don't fix our own problems from within, because when somebody gets destabilized, the other one reacts out of spite, and you have conflict, and we're living that conflict right now. So, you know, the leadership issue, you're right, is only the latest twist in a problem that's been simmering for a long time.
Now,
but still, I think we can address many of these issues with a more enlightened leadership. And we have elections every 4 years. We have another one coming up in 2 years, and who knows, we may have a new, more enlightened leader.
But, Professor, there's always debate about the so-called Big Bang theory, which is to change the policies immediately, overall, as a whole, vis-a-vis the gradual approach theory. You see that debated at the end of the Cold War in some of the economies, particularly in Russia.
Sure.
You also see that in China over the past 40 years. So now, even China and the United States, about what approach to take for the two economies, that also applies here as well. So what do you think? Should that be a Big Bang, which you seem to suggest with the bilateral investment treaty?
I wouldn't call that a Big Bang. I mean, to me, a Big Bang is when you put your economy through a shock.
Yeah, right.
I'm not suggesting that we put either economy through a shock, although a trade war, if it gets out of hand, could be exactly that. So there's the longer we are stuck in a trade war, the greater the chance of escalation and an unexpected development, which could be a shock. The Big Bang I'm suggesting is just to do some sensible policy. But I don't want to shock therapy for any economy, China or the United States. That's not what the citizens of the people of either nation want or deserve.
Before we go, final question for you, Professor. I know you not only an economist, but also you studied history both of China and the U.S. very well. Are there some equivalent time in both countries' history that you think we can draw inspirations from or across?
There's a lot of lessons from history. There always are. We can learn from when things go wrong. You know, the 1930s, for example, was a time of great national trauma in the United States, a period of enormous instability in China, and we know how far we went off the tracks and how we were able to pull ourselves up from the brink. We also know that from the standpoint of the United States, after the end of World War II, we were willing to sacrifice to rebuild our own economy after a war effort that took so much of our resources to fight. And we boosted our savings rate, we invested, we built infrastructure, we built a nationwide highway system, we focused on innovation, we were able to send a man to the moon. There were a lot of things that we didn't think we would be able to do, but we were able to put together a national resolve and a real commitment to do that. I think we can look back on those times as critical points in our own history, and I think with China, beginning in the late 70s under Deng Xiaoping, with reform and opening up, that was a spark that was lit, that's still lit a flame that's still burning today. And reforms, as they were the answer back then, are also the answer today for China. So there are a lot of, just important periods that both nations can look to for help, inspiration, and guidance for the future.
Professor Roche, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome back. China has been committed to reform and opening up over the past 4 decades. That message was made loud and clear to the world when China's annual political season wrapped up recently in March. A number of reform and opening up measures are widely published by the Chinese side to investors and businesses all over the world. Steve Ordens, the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, told me that those messages are strong, but it is vital that the U.S. is on board with the momentum. Meanwhile, it is also extremely crucial that those policies are carried out well. Here's my interview with him. After the 2 sessions, as you may know, there are some kinds of consensus stronger for reform and opening up in this country. Does Washington understand that?
I think at present there is great skepticism about the continuing commitment to reform and opening. I was thinking, in fact, of the past few days are we witnessing a replay of Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour in 1992? When he went on that Southern tour and recommitted to reform and opening, the American business community didn't really believe it. They were skeptical. They thought that the 3 years before, where there was no reform and opening, had not changed. And only as China already jumped into the reform period, it took 2 or 3 years before that was recognized. The question, I think, that the China scholars are asking is the Liang Hui commitment to further reform and opening one which is going to be implemented or one which is not going to be implemented? So what Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer are going to be discussing is what's called the enforcement mechanism. So what if China makes these promises but doesn't implement them?
There's the issue of interaction between the two sides. When Washington continued to have suspicions against Beijing's implementation capabilities, Beijing will also become skeptical about the reactions coming from Washington. So as you may know very well, there's interaction between the two sides.
Right. So we need to kind of get both sides to begin to rebuild trust, that we've seen a real deterioration in trust in the strategic side, in the diplomatic side, in the economic side. So all of these have fed upon each other, leading to a substantial increase in the level of distrust between the two sides, which is not good. We can have disagreements, but we have to have frank discussions of those disagreements and be able to then move forward on other issues while we disagree on some issues. America still has tariffs. America still has, both sides should reduce tariffs on each other's goods. That what we're doing now is, instead of reducing it, we're increasing it. Both sides are increasing it. And that's bad for the people of China, and it's bad for the people of the United States.
You know, Mr. Ordens, in the next few months, there's likely to be regulations also coming out from the United States about, for example, exports, for example, technologies in regards to what is national security and what is not. And meanwhile, CFIUS is also likely to adjust some of its relevant rules. So a lot of things that actually the U.S. could send positive signals to China, or the other way around.
Well, I think what we need to do is jointly arrive at a careful definition of national security, which does not include economic security. That what's happening is both countries are slipping into this dangerous definition where if there's a competitor in the United States or there's a competitor in China, we define this as national security and we don't allow the investment to occur. The winner is the 1/100th of 1% of the country that benefits from that. The loser is the other 99.99% of both China and the United States. I spent my life as an investor. I used to love incumbent protection. I made money.
You were sitting in a different chair.
I was sitting in a different chair. I made money. I didn't have to work as hard. the government protected my monopoly. It was great, but it wasn't necessarily good for the people. It wasn't necessarily good for the public as a whole. So I think that is not good government policy, and it's both governments that are doing this now.
But from the end of last year, I'm sure, Mr. Audience, you have taken notice, given your experience in China, of a series of mechanisms coming from the Chinese side. But as you said at the very beginning of our interview, whether the other side will be able to be sophisticated enough and good-willed enough to understand this and also reciprocate with the right attitude for the long term, that is the question. Now, what is giving you the confidence that Washington will be able to do that?
It's to a large degree up to the Chinese government to implement policies which are in the interests of the Chinese people and will basically level the playing field for lots of different industries. Equity caps need to be ended. The restricted list needs to be narrowed. If that happens, I believe that the American business community, the American government, are going to be persuaded that this is in their interests. I can't answer the question in the short term, is that going to happen? You know, the president will make these decisions, and I don't know what decisions he's going to make. But in the long term, it's the people who are going to make these decisions, both the people of China and the people of the United States. And they're going to decide in favor of constructive, stronger relations between the United States and China.
And that's what you've been working for throughout the decades.
That's what for 40 years I've been working on it, and I'm not prepared to give it up.
But the question really is, if one party, after agreed with the terms, walked away from the agreement, which is one of the biggest concerns right now while the negotiations are going on, what would that mean for the overall relationship? Now,
it would mean a severe disruption in trade between the United States and China. It would injure China. It would injure the United States. It would injure world economic growth. It would be bad for all parties. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but I'm very clear that it will be bad for everyone in the world.
But what kinds of mechanism or safety measures, Mr. Audience, given your knowledge of the U.S.-China relations and the politics of Washington, that we could have in mind just for crisis management?
The best crisis management mechanism we have now is a meeting between President Xi and President Trump.
But as you may know, all has to be settled before that happens.
The crisis mechanism is unfortunately just the senior leaders of both governments. But it's always been that way, that we've had difficulty over this 40 years. We've had difficulty, we've had lots of ups and downs, and it's always been up to the senior leaders of China and the senior leaders of the United States to understand that a constructive U.S.-China relationship is in the interest of world peace, is in the interest of economic growth, and when there is this kind of deterioration, they insert themselves, whether it was President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, President Clinton.
Where does your confidence come from in terms of a reasonable shaping of China-U.S. relations?
My optimism is always in the long term. Having been at this for 40 years, I've seen lots of 43 years. I've seen lots of ups and downs in the U.S.-China relationship. And in the end, the problems of the world, climate change, terrorism, pandemics, and economic growth can only be confronted when there's a cooperative U.S.-China relationship, not when there's a confrontational one. And that, in the end, is what's going to drive the politics in China and the politics in the United States.
Mr. Audience, before we go, some final questions for you. How do you think so-called people-to-people relations, despite the now geopolitics priority, will still be able to maintain its texture and its essence?
The people-to-people relationship is what's going to determine the future of the U.S.-China relationship, because in the end, the political leaders of China and the United States need to follow what the people think, and the people are going to argue for a constructive relationship, both the people of America and the people of China, because those bonds are so strong. And it's not just my friends, but it's the friends of millions of Americans and the friends of millions of Chinese, and so many Chinese who have studied in the United States and come back. And it's Americans who studied in China and returned to the United States, that those bonds are unbreakable. They're unbreakable. And no matter what happens at the high political level, the strength of those bonds are ultimately going to prevail. And that's why I'm an optimist.
Stephen Orleans, as always, a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure to be here. Great
and
to see you.
And also for your work. Thanks. Thanks, sir. Stephen Orleans. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type in World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and my team here in China, thanks for watching. Bye for now.